into LinkedIn or Facebook or how many friends you have or what your connections are around you. But there's a difference between transactional relationships and transformational relationships. I want you to take a second. I want you to just turn to the person next to you, or and I just want you to answer this question. Show me that next slide. What's the difference? What's the difference between a transactional relationship and a transformational relationship? Okay, I'm going to push you to think a little bit. Turn to the person next to you and just have a quick conversation. I'm not going to give you long. Just answer that question. What's the difference? What's the difference? What's the Share what you heard. Not what you shared, share what you heard. What's the difference? What's the difference between transactional and transformational? What did you hear from the person you talked to? Go ahead.
Transactional is just a passing conversation or something. You meet somebody, you go on your way. Transformational is somebody that you meet that changes your life.
Okay. Alright. Alright, difference between passing moment and maybe a little bit more. Okay? What else? What else did you hear from somebody else? What's the difference?
We talked about how it could be more than just, more than a passing moment. It could be an ongoing relationship if it's about some mutual third topic. Like if you're coworkers, right? You can work on a project, you can work on a goal together, but not ever really get to know each other.
You could be transactional for a long period of time, couldn't you? Absolutely. Your marriage could be transactional. My marriage could be transactional. I've been married 36 years. My relationship with my grandchildren, my children can be transactional, or it can be transformational. Sometimes it's passing moment. Sometimes it's long term. What else? What are the differences? What'd you hear? Go ahead.
Transformational. That's what we're doing here. There's change.
There's change. You've gone from one to something different because of that relationship. Interesting.
The depth of what you share. That's you share something of each of those, but the depth of what you share.
Yeah. Is there anything wrong with transactional relationships?
No.
You need them, right?
Necessary.
I went to Burger King on my way up here. I wanted a bacon double cheeseburger, small fries, and a small Dr. Pepper. The place I went to was called Burger King, and they had that. It was a great transaction. I don't know the girl's name who helped me. She opened the window of her house. She was very nice. I handed her some money. We had a transaction, and we were both happy. I was happy with what I got, and I hope she was happy with what she got. It happens all the time, right? You go to the grocery store, you need, because your wife gave you the list, and you get that transaction done. There's nothing wrong with transactions until that's all your life is made up of. If all your life is made up of are transactional relationships, you will wither and die a lonely person. And more importantly, so will the people around you. Because God's created you for more. God's created you to receive more, and God's created you to give more. Because He is more. We've just come through a season of COVID that's reduced the world to transactions. You need to go to school, you can jump online, you can get this online. You need to go to church, you can grab the content from church and bring it into your house, but it's not the same. You now can work from anywhere you want to. And there's some wonderful things in that. It's created mobility, it's created independence, but we're losing out on the ability to connect with people. And then you throw fear and anxiety on top of that. And the suicide rate is at an all-time high. People walking around with anxiety is at an all-time high. Because our life has been reduced to transactions. See, there's nothing wrong with transactions until it becomes all of your life. A couple things to think about. Transactional relationships are marked by tasks to get done, shared services, little connection, little to no emotion, and zero vulnerability in a transaction. I go to Starbucks and I want my grande pike. I'm not looking for the girl behind the counter to tell me her story. I just want some coffee. Right? I want it, she's got it. See, that's what marks transactional relationships. Transformational relationships are different. They're marked by communication, by connection, by emotion and vulnerability, experiences that bring you closer, by encouragement. Remember what Carla Gasser said? That all of us are walking around. Whether we consider ourselves introverts or extroverts, social experts or socially awkward, we're all walking around desiring deep relationship, connection. But many of us are failing to find it, and many of us are failing to live it out. Brene Brown said this: connection is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen and heard and valued. When they can give and receive without judgment. Think about that statement for a second. Connection. Connection is the energy that exists. And hold on to this because we'll come back to it. When people feel seen and heard and valued. God has created you and every other person on this planet to be seen and heard and valued. And for some of you, you come to this point in time in life and you say, you know what, it hasn't been true in my life. It wasn't true in the home I grew up in. It hasn't been true in a lot of relationships I've had. You feel invisible. You feel anything of value. And God says, I want more for you. God says, I have more for you. When we can give and receive without judgment. The most significant opportunities that many of us have in life for real purpose and real meaning are found in transformational relationships. Unfortunately for many of us, you know what we settle for? We settle for a transactional life. We go to work, we run our staff meeting, we manage our budgets, we interact with our clients, we build our organizations. We settle for transactional living, and God has wired you and God has wired me for transformational living. Men who want to live the way God intended us to live will learn to prioritize transformational relationships over transactions that need to get done. There's nothing wrong with getting stuff done. You and I have got to get stuff done. We do have businesses to run. We do have organizations that function. We do have things that have to move forward. There's nothing wrong with transactions. Until I look up and realize my entire life is nothing other than transactions. And I wonder why I'm so lonely. I wonder why I'm so disconnected. I find myself asking questions like, is there more than this? I have a friend in Washington State who has built an empire of a company. Close to $50 million He's got everything you can imagine in his organization. He's one of the loneliest people I've ever connected with and talked to. Because his life is all about transactions. I have this and I exchange it for that. And he's looking up in his 60s. He's struggling in a marriage. He's struggling with his kids. He's struggling with his grandkids. He's got every toy on planet Earth. He can do anything he wants to do. The thing he wants the most is like sand falling through his hand, trying to grab water, because there's zero connection in his life. There's nothing wrong with transactions until I look up and realize I built my entire life on that. You and I were made for more. God calls us to live for more. And men who want to live the way God intended us to live will learn to prioritize. Catch that word, prioritize. Transformational relationships over transactional need to get done. Don't hear that they're either or. You and I get to choose. Is it just going to be Chronos life that rolls through? Or are we going to grab those Kairos moments and see God show up? See connections in your life that actually touch your soul. Not just a life of transactions. Let me show you what this looks like. If you got a Bible, open it to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16. We're going to just touch down on a couple of passages real quick. Genesis chapter 16, and if you're familiar with your Bible, we're going to talk about a guy by the name of Abraham. And Abraham and Sarah, Abraham was a guy that God chose and spoke into his life and said, I want you to go to a land that I will show you, and I'm going to build a great nation out of you. And in Genesis chapter 15, God actually takes Abraham outside. And he shows him the stars in the sky for a few minutes. And he said to Abraham, I'm going to raise up out of you and Sarah more people than you can see stars. I'm going to raise up a nation out of you. A nation that will be my people. I've got a special purpose for you, Abraham. That's Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 16 is 10 years later. 10 years after God took Abraham outside and showed him all the stars and said, I'm going to build a family through you. 10 years have gone by, and Abraham and Sarah still don't have a single child. And so Genesis chapter 16. We pick it up right there in verse 1, and it says, Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, Hey, the Lord has kept me from having children, so go and sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Okay, so here's what's happened. Abraham and Sarah, 10 years past that conversation, and they decide God needs some help. God needs some help. Apparently, Sarah says, God has kept me from having children, and so I have an idea. Now, we're going to get into this story, but let me just give you a heads up as a man. Anytime you and I decide to help God out, it's going to go bad. Okay? It is. It's going to go bad. And it's going to go bad in the story. But God's going to show up, and He's going to model for us what transformational relationships look like. So let's keep reading. So Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. Right? What a God in there. So after Abraham had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took an Egyptian slave, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarah said to Abraham, You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. You ever been there? It's ManCamp, right? And Sarah looks up, it's her idea, right? She's like, you know what, God needs some help. That's why I got an idea. I've got this Egyptian slave, Hagar. And so I'm thinking, maybe Abraham, you sleep with her, we'll kind of bring her into the family, and we'll get children through Hagar. And then Hagar becomes pregnant, because Abraham looked at his wife and said, Sure, I'll do that. He sleeps with her, she gets pregnant, And now you have two women, sister wives, right? It's on TV now. Sister wives, and the one is pregnant, having children, the other one wants to have children. But what can go wrong with that? And the one who wants to have children, Sarah, she looks at Abraham and says, it's your fault. You are the reason I'm suffering. And he's like, me? Whose idea was this, right? To which was met with that nice elbow that you and I both received. We've all been in this moment. You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. And then Abraham, being a really godly man, an incredible leader, says to his wife, hey, the slave's in your hands. Do whatever you want. Right? Do with her whatever you think. So Sarai mistreated Hagar. So she fled from her. This is a transactional relationship gone really, really wrong. Really wrong. This is Abraham and Sarah not trusting God, deciding we're going to help God out, and we're going to do that by using another person. And her name is Hagar. Hagar's a slave. She's a possession. She doesn't have any opinion in all of this. But she's used and abused, and she's cast aside. And eventually Sarah says, get out of my sight. And so Hagar flees to the desert, where she's considering all she wants to do is just have this over and be done. There are a lot of people in our world exactly like Hagar. They've been used and abused, they've been cast aside, and they have been victims of transactional relationships their entire life. And God gives us a model of how He wants us to live. Look at verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that was beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Here's what the angel of the Lord does. The angel of the Lord is a nice way of saying Jesus showing up in the Old Testament. God shows up in Hagar's life, and the first thing He does is He calls her by name. Hagar. And then He asks a question. Where have you come from and where are you going? Here's the message He wants to communicate more than anything else. Hagar, I see you and I hear you. And you matter. You matter. She hasn't been told at any other moment up until now that she matters. She's been simply a possession to get pregnant and deliver something that people want. And God shows up and says, I'm not a God who's transactional. I'm a God who's transformational. Hagar calls her by name. Where have you come from and where are you going? And look at the difference it makes in her life. She says back to the angel, hey, I'm running away from my mistress. And then the angel would have said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. What a difficult message. You mean the woman who was mistreating me? You mean the couple who? Yes. Go back and submit. And you know what? She doesn't. She doesn't. God says, out of you, I'm also going to bring a nation. But what's the difference between a few minutes ago when she's ready to end her life and now she's ready to actually go back and submit to the same people who mistreated her? You know what the difference is? She was seen and heard. She was valued for maybe the first time in her life. And then Hagar does something extraordinary. I think she is the only person in the Bible who actually gives God a name. God has a lot of names. Most of the time He tells us His name. But Hagar is the only one I can find in Scripture You look down at verse 13, and then she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. And that is why the well was called Bir Hairoi, and it's still there between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar says, that's the God that I just got to know, the God who sees and hears, and I got to see the God who sees me. I am convinced that this is how God wants you and I to live our lives. First of all, recognizing and realizing that God sees you and God hears you. And you may look at your life and say, you know what, you don't know my life, and you're right, I don't. You don't know what I've been through, and you're right, I don't. But God does. And no matter what the circumstance in your life, God says, just like he said to Hagar, where are you coming from and where are you going? And he calls you by name. Because you are created in his image. And he desires to be the God who shows up and sees you and hears you. No matter what. Transformational living, not just transactional living. Jesus was a master at taking moments that could have been nothing but transactional and turning them into transformational moments. I want you to think about a couple of stories that are fairly familiar to you. Jesus was a master at this. I want you to think about John chapter 4 just for a minute. You can read it later, maybe in your free time. But John chapter 4, Jesus in the middle of the day, he comes to a well. And there's a woman there. And she's drawing water at the well. In the middle of the day, which you get, if you've been around your Bible, you know that was not common. Women would draw water in the morning or in the evening. She's out in the middle of the day because she's by herself. And Jesus steps up, and the transaction is, Jesus says, can you give me something to drink? She had the ability to do that. The transaction was in front of them. It was a transactional moment. I am thirsty, you have some water. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He begins to see her. He begins to talk to her. He begins to recognize her. He introduces himself. And then he takes another step and says, hey, I'd actually love to meet your husband. And she says, well, actually, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, well, that's sort of true. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with now, that's not really your husband. So technically what you said is true. But what about those other 5? You would think this would be a moment where she would run away from Jesus, but it's not what happens. Instead of taking a step back, she takes a step forward and says, ooh, I can see that you are a prophet. What else do you have? End of that story in John chapter 4, she goes back to her town, the town that has ostracized her, the town that she has come out in the middle of the day to draw water, and she invites everybody in town. You've got to meet the man who knows everything about me. He still loves me. Jesus took a transactional moment and made it transformational. By getting just past what was needed in the moment to see her and connecting with her. Think about Luke chapter 19. Little Zacchaeus. Right? Tax collector, wealthy, plenty of status. Jesus is coming through town, and Zacchaeus runs to a sycamore tree, and he climbs up on a branch. He's in complete transactional mode. He's heard about Jesus. He just wants to catch a peek of him. And Luke 19 says, when Jesus came to the spot, he stopped, and a kairos moment is about to unfold. He stops, he looks up into the tree, and he calls him by name. Zacchaeus, today I'd like to be a guest in your house. My house, your house. And Zacchaeus looks around and he doesn't know what to do. So he scurries down from the tree and he says to Jesus, you gotta take me as I am, because I don't even remember if I made my bed today. And Jesus is like, that's not important, it doesn't matter. And we don't catch much of that conversation. The next thing we see is Zacchaeus stepping out of that lunchtime appointment a changed and different person. Because Zacchaeus, who knew everything about transactions, he was a Jew working for a Roman Empire, taxing his own people and taxing them grossly. He was a trader of all traders. He knew everything about transactions, and people knew that about him. But Jesus broke through all of that by seeing and hearing, calling him by name, being vulnerable, and calling him to the same, and changed his life. I want you to think about Luke chapter 8 and verse 43, and this one I'm going to read to you. Where we see Jesus do an unbelievable confrontation and connection. Luke chapter 8, verse 10 says this, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were expecting him. And as Jesus was on his way through the crowd almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. But no one could heal her. She came up behind Jesus and she touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. And when they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding you and pressing against you. But Jesus said, no, somebody touched me. Power has gone out from me. And then the woman seeing she could not go unnoticed, she came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had become instantly healed. And then he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. If ever there was a woman who wanted nothing more than a transaction from Jesus, it's this story right here. She's been bleeding for 12 years. Another gospel tells us that she has spent all her money. She's gone to doctors who did not help her. Bleeding in this time and day and age would have made her unclean. She couldn't go to church. She couldn't be around friends. She's lonely and disconnected. And she's heard about Jesus. And her plan is, if I can just get to him, I heard he's healed some people. If I just get to the edge of his cloak, I touch his cloak, I get a little bit of Jesus to go. And I'll be on my way healed. And that happens. That happens. Jesus is pushing through the crowd. The crowd is almost crushing him. She somehow waits for her moment, steps out from the alley, grabs a hold of Jesus' cloak, and she can instantly feel, I have been healed. And then Jesus stops. And he asks, who touched me? Peter. It had to be Peter, right? He's like, come on, Jesus. Everybody's touching you if you haven't noticed. And Jesus is like, no. This is different. I felt the power go out from me. Now, gee, I just ask a question at this point in time. Well, why call this woman out? Why call her out? Hasn't her life been bad enough already? 12 years she's been bleeding, she shouldn't have any money, she's finally healed, and Jesus, really, you're going to call her out? Why would you do that? But Jesus just stops, and he says, no, somebody touched me. He's a creator of time, right? She's like, I have all the time in the world, literally. I'm not going anywhere. And so he stops. And finally, the passage says, trembling, look on the back, says, it was me. I touched you. Why would Jesus call her out? You know why? Because he loved her so deeply. And he wasn't just interested in the transaction of healing her body. He wanted to transform every area of her life, including her public reputation. And so he looks at her and he says, daughter, there's a term we use. Daughter? And the crowd whispered, that's his daughter. No, that's not what he means. He means that he recognizes her. She's important to him. And then Jesus says these words, your faith has healed you. And the crowd says, what? What did he say? Did he say she's healed? Yes, he said she's healed. He wanted to restore not only her body, but her reputation. He wanted it to be a public moment, as he was after transformation, not transactions. He wanted to impact every single area of her life. And when that story circulated through town, people were validated. No, she's not the same person. She's not bleeding. She's not unclean. Jesus, the Messiah, healed her. I was there. I saw her. Jesus set her free. He called her by daughter. He did it publicly. We live in a world full of transactions. And yet there are so many moments in front of us with the opportunity to be set free from Jesus, to have transformational connection with people like us. Jesus was a master at modeling exactly that. Show me 2 slides. One more. Here's what I want to suggest. Transformational relationships take intentional moments, touch points. Touch points where a person feels seen and heard. Moments of staying close, joining together, and being glued together. Moments that you and I can choose. Is this a transactional relationship? Am I happy with transaction? Is that all that I want to do? Or are the people around me worth a transformative relationship? Your wife, your children, your friendships, your church, the men in this room. It's possible to be in a long-term relationship with people, some of the people in this room you've known for years, and you've stayed in a transactional love. And God calls us to live. If I want to live the way God intended me to live, as a man of God, He calls me to live. Next slide. There's some simple ways. Entrances and exits. It is so easy to take people for granted. But when people enter your life or exit your life, you take a moment and stop and even call them by name. My wife and I have a rule come to our house. Whoever has been out of the house, when they come back in the house and they announce, hey, I'm home, wherever I'm at or wherever she's at, we get up from where we are and we go and we greet that person, even just for a moment. Because I don't want to take my wife for granted, and she doesn't want to take me for granted. When I walk into my place of business and walk the hallways, I can go straight to my office and get stuff done, or I can actually stop and recognize and see people. I can choose transaction. What can these people do for me? Or I can choose transformation. I see you and I hear you. I don't want to pay attention to you. Appreciation and admiration. We often think it in our head. We just don't say it out loud. Or we wait until somebody dies. And then we show up at their funeral as we should. What if you said those same words when somebody's so on? See, appreciation and admiration lead to transformation, not transactions. Affection. Being able to reach out and touch someone. Maybe it's a fist bump, maybe it's a handshake, maybe it's a pat on the shoulder, maybe it's a hug. Maybe it's with your wife to stop and just have a moment of affection. And to say, it's good to see you. Remember when you were dating? Don't let it tell you to be affectionate when you were dating. But now we look up, we've been married 5, 10, 15, 36 years, and it's just easy to be transactional instead of transformation. Sharing real life, including my failures, leads to transformation. If I want everybody to think that I do everything well, I can stay on a transactional level. Be vulnerable? Why would I do that? Because that's where transformation comes from. When I'm willing to say this is real life, and I don't always get it right. When I'm willing to go to my children and apologize, you know what, I actually screwed that up, and you forgive me. When I can say that to my wife or a coworker, that's on me. I did that. You know what that leads to? It leads to them wanting to do the exact same thing. Transformation instead of transactions. Having fun together. Having a spiritual connection of some kind leads to transformation. Being willing to pray for each other and with each other. I told you we moved to Quito in 1999. We started doing youth ministry, we were training national leaders, and we launched a camp, and we had some formal parts of our ministry where we were very strategic in. But there was another area of our ministry that just happened. It was a ministry that eventually began to work with street kids. But we never set out to work with street kids, it just sort of happened. I was walking one day between a school that I was doing some teaching at my office. And a little guy came by and he saw me and he said in Spanish, "Hey, mister, you have any food?" "Tengo hambre, I'm hungry." And I saw him and I said, "Yeah, I can get you some food." And there was a bread store not too far away. There's a lot of bread stores there in Quito. I walked over and I bought him a piece of bread and a little juice box. And I said, "Hey, the Lord bless you. Have a good day." And I kept going. Felt good about myself. Hopefully he got over at E. Turned out his name was Carlos. Carlos is not an idiot. The next day, Carlos was back. Carlos now had Alex with him. School that I worked at pretty regularly, I walked that route pretty regularly. Now that was two of them. Señor, tenemos hambre. We're hungry now. Can you help us again? I think I can. We walked over and I bought two of them guys, bread and a juice box. Well, you know where this story is going, right? A couple days later, there's 3, there's 4, there's 5, there's 8. Man, gringo's good for a meal, right? But I stopped and I said, I'll tell you what, today's a little bit different. We're not going to get you a pancito. We're going to go over here to this little restaurant. I'm going to actually buy you lunch. But here's the deal, I want to hear your story. I don't know what you're doing here. These kids were 8, 7, 8 years old. What are you doing on the street? Where are you from? And as they sat there and sort of ate their food, kind of giggled with each other, they began to tell me their story. Boris, he was from Colombia. He had left his house when he was 7 years old, got in a fight with his mom, crossed the border, and came into Ecuador. Wow. He had connected with these other little boys. They were living in the city park, Parque Catalina. There's some swing set and an old airplane. They were living in the airplane. And we had lunch together, and that led to another lunch together. And oh, I don't know where this is going, but Jesus, I just want to move forward on this thing. One day I asked him, where do you guys shower? It's pretty obvious you don't. Well, we jump in the fountain every once in a while, and it's okay, but today, boys, we're going to take a shower. And I had a little building. We had moved offices, and that old office building was there. And I talked to the landlord, and I said, "Hey, I got a plan." He's like, "Great," you know, and I rented it. And so pretty soon these boys were coming in, and they were coming to this old office. And now we're 8, 10, 15, 20 sometimes, and they'd come in, and I shared with my kids some of what was going on, and I'm like, "Hey, guys, you got some extra shoes?" "Yeah, we do." And my kids got some shoes, they talked to their friends, pretty soon we had a little, pantry of food going on, some clothes going on, and these boys would come in 2 days a week. I'd let them take a shower, change their clothes, eat a little bit of food, and I would sit down and I would tell them, "Hey, I'm going to tell you about my friend Jesus." And sometimes they cared, and a lot of times they did. And this went on for a little while. A couple months, turned into a year. And I remember thinking this very conversation. And I remember saying to God, "God, what are we doing here?" Because it doesn't seem like we're getting through to these boys. where the transactions are happening, that's not terrible. Lord, you tell us to feed the poor, and so maybe I'm just feeding the poor. I don't know. You tell me to have an eye for the kids. I'm trying to do that. But I have to be honest, Lord. I don't want to do transactions here. I want to see these kids' hearts changed. I'm just going to have one of these all out with God, right? Well, God would answer that prayer in a dramatic, incredible way. One night I was at a basketball game. My oldest son was playing at the local international school. And I'm sitting up in the stands. And out in front of the international school, there's a guard. And he comes in, and I knew him, he knew me. He said, Señor Felipe, yeah, that's me. He said, hay un grupo de jóvenes enfrente, pero cuidado, right? There's a group of kids in front, but be careful. Be careful of what? Son muy grave. It's really serious, it's happening. But let's go out and find it. So I walk out front, and here's Alex and Miguel Angel. And they've got Boris in their arms. And Boris is not speaking. In fact, Boris has blood running all the way down his face on his shoulder. I looked at him and I said, "Look, what's up?" And what they told me was he got hit by a bus. What I found out later was they were actually robbing someone. They used to call it resource sharing. Those are the words they use. Big part, right? But no, they have extra resources. We think they should share. Usually people want to share the resources, boys. They were robbing someone. And the person caught up to them they were robbing and took a skateboard deck to Boris's head. That's what actually happened. But in that moment, they said to me, "You got hit by a bus, and we don't have any other place to go. Will you help us?" I said, "Of course I'll." And so we walked just a short distance to the local hospital. And I walked in and knew the social worker, and I said, "I need some help." And she said, "Bring him right here." And they took Boris in, and they ended up shaving his head, putting a plate in his head, and surgery. And Boris was in the hospital for about a week and a half, recuperating. And I remember that process. The boys would come, they would visit. We would stand and talk. And we've been together for about a year plus, just doing transactions. Feeding them, clothing them, spending time with them. Sure, I was talking about Jesus, but nothing seemed to stick. I remember standing and as they unpacked the story about Boris getting beat up with a skateboard. I said, "Guys, why did you bring him to me? Why me?" I remember Miguel Angel, he looked at me and he said, "Because we knew you would help." I said, "How did you know that?" I said, "Well, Phil, you know our names. You've heard our stories. You've given us things like shoes and clothes that nobody else has done. We knew you would help." And as Boris laid in that hospital there, he had a lot of time on his hands, and I brought in a video player with the Jesus film. And I showed it to Boris in French. And we sat there and watched. As I got to the end of the Jesus story and Jesus was crucified, Boris has tears running down his face, and he says to me in Spanish, why did that man let them do that to him? So you don't know who that man is, Boris? But I have no idea who that man is. That man is Jesus. He hung on a cross for you. I unfolded the gospel in front of them. I unfolded it many times for them. But in that kairos moment, Boris said, "I want to know that Jesus." He gave his life to Christ. And that was a breakthrough, not just Boris, but most of those young men we were working with. God showed up in a transformational way. Today, Miguel Angel, black African American from a really rough part of Tito, loved to fight with knives. Today, Miguel Angel is married to Desiree and have two beautiful children who are missionaries in Norway. Boris, the kid whose head got kicked in, married to a beautiful woman with children. He's a missionary in Kiev, reaching out to former street kids. And the stories go on and on and on. Because transactions that were necessary, those kids needed to eat. They needed some clothes. But they needed so much more. They needed Jesus. And that only happens through transformation. And willingness to do some simple things. Learn some names. Spend some time. Share some of my own life. Asking Jesus to show up. Not settle. Not settling for transactions. You see, I want to encourage you guys. Do not settle for a false sense of connectedness that offers only transactional interactions. Commit to a transformative relationships. Choose authentic connections over comfort, convenience, and casual interaction. You see, the truth is, you don't have to do anything to build transactional relationships. They're just going to happen. They happen naturally. They happen every day. You want things, and people want things. You can provide them, and other people can provide them. There's nothing you have to do to foster transactional relationships. But if you want to live transformationally, that's going to take intentionality. That's going to take realizing God is the one who says, I see you and I hear you, and I want you to live out of that. And then you don't have to go to Kilo Equimart to see God use you. We've had a tremendous privilege to do that. But you know what? Your wife wants the exact same thing. Your children, your grandchildren, the people you work with, the people you rub shoulders with every day, they're waiting for someone to be willing to have a transformational relationship with them. And God says, if you will trust me, I will show up in those Kairos moments. And God will use you to change incredible lives. And the greatest person who will be changed is you. You see, sometimes I'll hear people say to me, I can never do what you did. And I laugh and say, that's ridiculous. I'm a really, really ordinary person. The greatest benefactor of surrendering to Jesus is you. Is the person who surrenders. Jesus is the one who said, I came to give you life and give it to you abundantly. Paul wrote, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come. Paul would also write to the Romans, right? I want to invite you to offer your body to the living sacrifice. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Here would be the Philippine translation. Don't settle for transactional living. I want you to be transformed, and God wants to use you to transform others. And so I would just invite you to do a little bit of arm work in your own heart. How do you do it? How do you do it living transactionally versus transformationally? Here's a place to start. For some of you, you're living transactionally with God himself. That needs to change. You've made a bargain with God, you're doing a little deal with him. God, I'll give you a little bit of time, I'll go to church occasionally, I'll give you a little bit of my money, and what I expect from you is, and it's just a transaction. You do something for God, and you expect him to do something for you. And you wonder why. I feel so distant from God, so lonely from God. I don't feel like it's close at all. I want you to be bold enough to even share with him your failures. To come to him and say, God, I know that you see me, I know that you hear me. I want to see the God who sees me. And so maybe this weekend will be the weekend when you would say, you know, that's kind of me. I sort of live transactional with God. As if he's kind of a vending machine. I put my coins in, I hope you get the right thing out. realize that doesn't work out very well. For some of you, you've been living transactionally with your marriage. And your wife wants more from you. You're not willing to be vulnerable, you're not willing to be honest, you're not willing to communicate. You kind of fall into that routine, and hey, I need to go to work, and you take the kids, and we do soccer practice, and I pay the bills, and you look up and realize, this isn't my marriage. It's time to be honest enough and have a conversation with your wife. To practice entrances and exits. To not just think about affection, but actually express it. To not just think about what you appreciate, but say it out loud. Get out on a date night with your wife. To have some kind of spiritual connection. Maybe it's one time a week you sit down with your wife for 15 minutes. Read some of God's Word and pray together. You know, one time a week. The reality is one time a week is more than most people have in a marriage. What would it look like to live transformationally with your children? Not just provide for them, show up for them. Transactional relationships are marked by tasks that get done, shared services, little connection, little to no emotion, zero vulnerability. If you haven't figured it out already, let me tell you where that heads to. That ends up a lonely, empty life. It's not what Jesus meant when he said, I've come to give you life and give you abundantly. It's not what he promises. If I want to be a man of God the way God intended me to live, I've got to prioritize transformational living over transactions. Transformational relationships are marked by communication and connection, emotional vulnerability, experience and bringing closer and encouragement. Maybe this weekend, it's maybe even with one other guy, you begin to maybe even get a little bit vulnerable and hear a little bit more of somebody else's story and strength. See, we want our churches to be transformational. We want our men's ministry to be transformational. It starts with me. It starts with you. He has calling us to live higher and deeper with each other. We ever have before. Scary? Maybe a little. Worth it? Absolutely. Absolutely. Here's the last thing. Chronos and Kairos. God shows up in the Kairos moment. Now I'm just going to invite you. Right now. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask you to turn back to those guys you were talking to a few minutes ago. And I'm going to ask you to take a risk. I'm going to ask you maybe just to unpack one of those questions. Maybe it's a simple one. It's number one that says, hey, let's just caught your attention tonight. And share that with the person next to you. Maybe it's a little bit deeper as you evaluate. How you doing? You walk with God.